Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 9th of August. Today we're going to be doing a full frontline update, starting off with Kupyansk. So on the sector, the Russians have continued their advance, which they've been conducting really for the past 4 to 5 days. They've advanced along 3 different axes, one of them being along this road which starts at Vilshana and leads to the east of Sinkivka. I'll show the arrows for all this. So that's one vector. They haven't advanced much in this direction, and that's mainly because you have these fortified positions that are set up by the 14th Mechanized Brigade in this area. The main Russian advances have occurred on 2 different axes. One of them to the south of Vilshana directly, where the Russians are taking over these open fields and really just hills in general that were previously either gray zones or they were under Ukrainian control. So across a 6-kilometer front, they've been able to advance about 1 kilometer over the past 24 hours. Now, going a bit to the east and to the south, we see that the Russians have made their largest advances over the past day from this Persotravneve-Orleanske-Yahidne axis over here. Throughout this 10-kilometer front, you could say, that's what I'd say it is in terms of distance, something like this. They were able to advance about 2.5 kilometers at most. And they were able to relieve some of the pressure that was put on these frontline towns like Orleanske and Yahidne by taking over the open fields that are to the west of them. And now they have control of some positions that are to the north of towns such as Ivanivka and Kislivka, which are towns that the Ukrainians are using as defensive nodes in this area near the front line. Because after this set of towns, these 4 towns over here, you don't really have any other towns on the Oskil bridgehead for about 10 kilometers before you reach the towns that are adjacent to the Oskil River, like Kurilivka. So this is a very important area, these 4 towns over here. It's a very important cluster of towns that the Ukrainians must defend in order to maintain continuity on the front line. And we're already receiving reports of fighting around Kislivka. Perhaps these are Russian probing attacks. I don't believe that they're going to try to take the town because it is pretty fortified and their main concerns are a bit to the north. Well, let's overlay the Russian gains over the past 24 hours with the elevation map. Here you can see that really the most gains they've made in terms of the heights they've secured have been to the southeast around Persotravneve, where we were talking about just a second ago. You can see how they're securing heights and that not only this one ridge can potentially be under their control, but also another ridge to the south could also be taken under their control if they're able to continue with these assaults. Now, I don't think they're going to go for these ridges in the near future. I do think that perhaps that could be a long-term endeavor. The reason why I'm saying this is because really anytime that the Russians have launched an attack on this Vatova axis over really the past couple of months, they have been able to make some sizable gains for the first week or so, you could say. For the first few days, they're able to advance, then they gain momentum, and then it appears as if they're going to make some sort of significant breakthrough. But that never really happens, and that could be for one of 2 reasons, or maybe a combination of both, actually. One could be that the Ukrainians, they move in their reinforcements, and they're able to seal off any sort of gaps in the line, and then the Russians are just unable to advance anymore. The other possibility is that the Russians are not aiming to advance and achieve breakthroughs in this area. They were aiming to secure local gains that will shape the battlefield in a way that will allow them to make sort of larger offensive operations in the future, maybe in the winter, for instance. So you could believe whatever you want, but what I'll say is that just very recently, I think it was reported less than 24 hours ago, the 95th Air Assault Brigade, which is a unit which is stationed around Kremina, I'll show you guys where it's located, it's now been moved, or at least some of its elements have been moved to the Kupyansk sector to help assist the 14th Mechanized Brigade. So here is the 95th. Some of its units have been moved to the Kupyansk front, and who knows, maybe that will be enough to hold the front line and prevent the fall of Sinkivka and prevent any sort of Russian approaches towards the town of, or the city of Kupyansk itself. Now, moving to the Berkivka sector, we're going to look at this geolocated video. I have it linked in the geolocated marker over here. So what we're seeing here is that the Russian 85th Motor Rifle Brigade, which is a unit that I have not heard of previously, so I'm going to find the logo for it and everything. But this unit was able to clear the Ukrainian positions that are on these bush lines that are adjacent to the rail line that runs through this area. The rail line is over here, and then the bush lines are just adjacent to it, to the left and to the right. And those are some very good positions for the Ukrainian troops to entrench themselves in, but the Russians have cleared it out per this video. And this also indicates that the front line has shifted a bit to the west, with the Russians really having positions adjacent to this reservoir over here. This was something that I always had marked on my map. I always had the front line, or the dividing line between the Ukrainians and the Russians, adjacent to the reservoir. But now it seems like a lot of other maps are starting to map it the same way as I had it previously, based on this geolocated video. So I just wanted everybody to know of the existence of such footage. And we also know that the Ukrainians in recent days have tried to resume attacks on Berkivka, but based on this video, it seems like so far they've been unsuccessful. Now, moving a bit to the south, to the Klishivka area. In this area, the Ukrainians have resumed their attacks. They started off about, I think it was on the night of the 8th, actually. You had the 22nd Mechanized Brigade. They had the artillery preparations. They were doing large-scale barrages onto the Russian lines, specifically onto the Russian rail line and onto Klishivka and Andriivka and onto the rear. So that's where they were firing. And then after this artillery barrage, you had some Ukrainian mobile units, or not even mobile units. What I'd say is that they were small groups of infantry. They were not using any support from vehicles at all. They were just in small squads. And they tried attacking just to the south of Klishivka, around here. I'll show the direction. So you can see clearly that the Ukrainian goal by advancing in this direction is to take over the fields that are to the east of Klishivka in an effort to try to encircle it and to reach the rail line, which is now being constructed as a Russian line of defense. You can see over here. There was also an attempted Ukrainian advance onto the town of Andriivka directly. So far, the Russians do still hold onto most of the town, but I would say at this point that it is more of a gray zone, because you do have Ukrainians coming in and out of the town, and not all of it is under firm Russian control anymore. Now, moving on to the Stormayorsk front, specifically around Urozhaine, we do actually have a change to the front line. The Ukrainians have been able to not necessarily break through, but they have been able to push the Russians out of a certain entrenchment that they had. So what happened was, yesterday, you had two waves of Ukrainian assaults onto Urozhaine directly from the north. They were able to, at first, clear out the minefields that are to the north of Urozhaine and some of the fields in that area. I'll mark where those would be located, probably over here. So now a lot of these fields are a gray zone. The Russians don't have control over them. But what happened was, you had elements from the 35th and 36th Marine Brigades. Let me show you guys those units if you're not aware. Here's 36 and 35 is over here. And they were supported by artillery from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. They were able to, for a certain period of time, enter the town of Urozhaine directly from the north, through this road specifically. And they were able to push the Russians out of their trenches in this area, because the Russians actually set up a trench system in the northern part of the town. And that would be around here. And that's a big reason why the Ukrainians were unable to ever break through into the town itself, because the Russians were so deeply entrenched in this area, and it was very difficult to dislodge them. But now they've been able to do that for the first time. They entered the town temporarily, but during their entrance, they were fired upon heavily by the defenders, especially by the DPR. DPR artillery was working on the Ukrainian advances, and they were able to take out at least one Ukrainian BMP in the attack. So it does seem like the attack was repelled, but we don't know if the Russians have been able to retake their positions within those trenches. That's something that is still unknown. It seems like for now it's a gray zone, and the Russians have withdrawn deeper into the town of Urozhaine. Here's just a visual on those trenches in the northern part of the town, and this is from Deep State. And their map reflects basically what I have on my map. And you can see the one BMP that got destroyed, and this was also confirmed by Deep State. There's another BMP here. I don't know what happened to it, but you can see generally geolocated footage indicates that the Ukrainians, at least for a certain period of time, were in the northern part of that town. We'll have to see if they continue with those assaults. Now, on the Robotyne sector, we do have drone footage, which was published by RIA Novosti, Russian media, and it's been geolocated, so I have the link to that. And it just gives you an idea of the situation, not at ground zero, but pretty close to it, within Robotyne itself. You can see that the houses are not totally destroyed. Obviously, there's significant damage from shelling, but a lot of them still stand. And that's probably because we haven't seen the Ukrainians enter the town that much. For the most part, the Russians have had a firm grasp over the town itself. And the Ukrainians, obviously, they've launched multiple attacks on the flanks and to the north, but they've never really been able to penetrate into the town itself. So if you want, you could see that video for yourself. It's on my map. It's linked in the description. But today, really for the first time, we saw the Ukrainians actually successfully enter the northern part of Robotyne. What happened was you had this assault that was done by the 116th and the 118th Mechanized Brigades. These are two units from the 10th Army Corps, and we haven't seen them fighting that much on the front line. We saw more of the 47th and 33rd previously, so it is interesting to see new units being involved in the fighting. So here you can see for yourself those two units. They were able to advance through two hedgerows that are to the north of Robotyne. These two hedgerows over here. They were able to take them over, and then they entered the northern part of the town around this area over here. After, I don't know how long, might have been a couple of hours of fighting, they were pushed back. But it is still significant, as it is the first time the Ukrainians have actually entered the town itself. And just like Urozhaine, the northern part of Robotyne is extremely fortified with trenches. So those trench systems are extremely important to the Russians, and it's clearly a Ukrainian goal to dislodge them from those positions. Causing the Russians to leave their positions in the trench line will make it much easier to fully secure Robotyne. But what I see happening with Robotyne is very similar to some of these other frontline towns like Staromayorsk, is that it's going to be an effective mechanism for Russia to hold on to the current front line and to increase Ukrainian casualties as day in, day out they send these columns or these infantry groups to try to assault it. But eventually its utility to the Russians will become obsolete, as it's just going to be shelled into oblivion by both sides. And then there's not really going to be any sort of stable forward positions. And then it's going to become dangerous for the Russians to stay over there. And then you could see the Ukrainians tap into that and actually begin to advance, not just directly from the north, but also from the flanks, which is something that we've seen them do previously. Now, before we end the video, let's talk about the situation in Kherson. So we already know that the Ukrainians have a bridgehead across the Antonovsky Bridge. And recently the Ukrainians, over the past 2 days, you could say, they've also been able to cross the river near the town of Kozachi Laheri. So this area is relatively open. There's not many fortified positions, which is why most of it is just marked as a gray zone, all these floodplains. But for now, I do still have the town of Kozachi Laheri under Russian control. Russian sources and Ukrainian sources alike confirm that the Ukrainians in small DRG groups crossed the river and began setting up positions just to the west of the town. So that would be around here, you could see. Some Russian sources I've seen claim that they were able to push back the Ukrainians, but this is disputed by other Russian sources, and I've seen basically all Ukrainian sources say that so far they're still on the bridgehead. But again, the nature of these bridgeheads is that they're not aimed at launching a major offensive. They're mainly aimed at launching probing attacks and launching these smaller scale harassment operations against the Russian lines. And so it is possible that during the nighttime, you have troops getting rotated in and out. But anyway, what we're seeing more generally is that the Ukrainians have been able to take over some Russian POWs in the sector. There were 3 that the Ukrainians photoed. And then in response, I saw some Russian sources circulating a video of this Russian major who was filming 3 Ukrainian POWs that they claim were captured around the same sector, around this area over here of Kozachi Laheri. So the interesting thing about the video that the Russians released is that the guy that was filming that video is called Major Tomov. He's some major in the Russian military who was stationed around the Kherson sector that I've never heard of before. But apparently, once that video is released, you had some Russian troops that were on the ground that disputed the claims made in that video. And they said that Major Tomov and 16 men that he was leading, they were actually on a reconnaissance operation around Kozachi Laheri in response to the Ukrainian bridgehead that was established, and that they have been missing in action now, and that nobody really knows about their whereabouts. So the video that Major Tomov released of those Ukrainian POWs appears to be an older video and not from this most recent round of fighting. So we don't really know the status of Tomov and his 16 men in this area. But this is not the only area where Ukrainians have increased pressure. We also see them advancing near Oleshki. They're trying to flank the town now, not just from the north where they already have positions around the Antonovsky Bridge. And they can't really advance directly to the south in this area because all the bridges leading to Oleshki have been blown up by the Russians. But now they're advancing from the west. From the west, the Ukrainians have expanded their bridgehead directly to the south of Kherson. You could see these are the areas they've taking over a lot of docks and a lot of dachas on the coast or right adjacent to the Dnieper River. I would say the Ukrainian goal in this area would be to connect the bridgehead around the Antonovsky bridgehead, and the one that is directly to the south of Kherson. So that would look something like this. And they want to have a combined unity between these forces before they go on the attack towards Oleshki, which is definitely a part of Ukraine's longer term goals, but it's not something I see them doing now. Another thing that we saw them do, the Ukrainians, is reach these positions over here. They were able to take over some dachas in this area that are just adjacent to the Chaika River. I don't know if they're still there, but these positions are pretty close to Oleshki. And if the Ukrainians could establish a firm position in that area, they'd only be about 1 or 2 kilometers from the city itself. And that would give them also a road that could lead them directly into the town. You see this road over here? That one is not damaged at the moment and could, in theory, be used in the future. But that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.